everyone who has joined. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We're very excited to host this State of the Field Charting a Collective Agenda for Gender and Climate Security Research Roundtable. My name is Jessica Smith. I'm the Research and Policy Manager at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And we're grateful to Adelphi for inviting us to participate in the Berlin Climate and Security Conference, and very much looking forward to our conversation today. First, a few housekeeping notes. The session will be recorded and placed on the conference website. We invite you to use the chat function to ask questions to our panelists. And during the interactive Q&A portion, you can also use the raise hand function. We ask if you're not speaking that you keep your microphone muted, and don't forget to follow the conference at #BCSC2021 to keep the conversation going. I wanted to begin with a brief overview of our institute, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, and a little snapshot of the gender climate security nexus. So at the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security, we recognize climate change as a factor that cuts across gender, peace, and security with important implications for both policymakers and practitioners, not to mention those most affected by climate conflict impacts. This is an area of research we're actively scaling up. Earlier this year, we released a report on the climate-gender conflict nexus that highlighted women's contributions at the grassroots. And in 2020, the Institute published Women Building Resilient Cities in the Context of Climate Change, authored by Molly Kellogg, who I believe has joined us today for this session. Through our work, we've realized the importance of bridging silos between experts working on various aspects of the climate-gender security nexus. And we recognize the urgency to build the knowledge base for effective response. So this roundtable is our attempt to put this into practice, and we hope it will be one of many future conversations. This roundtable has convened top researchers from around the world working at the intersection of climate change, gender, and security. The purpose is to begin articulating a current landscape of research at this nexus and to identify synergies that could be leveraged to push the field forward. Joining us today, we have Cate Owren from the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, Janet Edmond from Conservation International, Maisha Alam from the United Nations University Center for Policy Research, Elizabeth Smith from the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, Angie Daźe of the International Institute for Sustainable Development, Hannah Elizabeth Kurnoth from Adelphi, and Marissa Enzer from the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. Speakers will present flash presentations of their main areas of research and identify what they see as the most urgent gaps in knowledge. The second half of the session will feature a broader conversation on the state of the field with the goal of identifying pathways towards accelerating meaningful progress. We hope the outcome of this roundtable will be a draft state of the field document that we will circulate for feedback and eventually share more broadly. Before we dive into the flash presentations, we wanted to give you a brief snapshot of the climate gender security nexus to help set the stage for our conversation today. The climate crisis is the existential threat of our time. The impacts of climate change inflame underlying political, social, and economic conditions, in some cases leading to forced displacement or provoking conflict. It's well documented that climate change multiplies risk, though for some, these risks are more heightened than others. Rather than directly or inevitably leading to conflict, climate change exacerbates underlying conditions like water and food insecurity, economic hardship, humanitarian crises or political fragility, all of which can weaken social cohesion and provoke new or renewed conflict. The key takeaway here is that climate vulnerability and conflict are interlinking and reinforcing. For example, in 26 of the 39 states classified as highly fragile by USAID, a large share of the population faces significant climate risks. And today, nearly all of the top 20 countries most exposed to climate change are also experiencing violence, instability, or armed conflict, and 13 of them host a UN humanitarian response. So for those working on various aspects of gender, climate, and security, we have to understand how these factors and dynamics map onto our agendas. Understanding the overlapping and reinforcing drivers of climate and conflict impacts can lead to better outcomes and ensure solutions are mutually reinforcing. But critically, interventions must be informed by a gender analysis. Gender shapes how people experience both threats. The gendered impacts of climate change and the ways in which women are disproportionately affected and less able to absorb and recover from climate shocks, in many cases mirror the same vulnerabilities women face in situations of conflict and fragility. Both climate and conflict exacerbate pre-existing vulnerabilities and patterns of discrimination. And importantly, the same structural inequalities that make women more vulnerable to climate change and conflict also marginalize them from participating in the solutions. Women are one of the best and most underutilized forces to combat the climate crisis, and we cannot effectively address climate change or climate-related conflict without women. As stakeholders across sectors are galvanized to address the climate crisis, we must ensure women are centered in interventions, that climate policy is gender sensitive, and that women have full and equal access to these opportunities. Gender responsive climate intervention has the potential to create cascading effects that positively impact not only the climate crisis, but also strengthen efforts to advance gender equality and global peace and security. We hope this conversation today will be the first of many that work to bridge efforts to address climate, gender, and security. And with that, I'll turn to our speakers, each of whom are working on some aspect of this nexus. They will present an overview of their organization and the main focus of their climate research. They will also share what they see as the most urgent gaps in knowledge in the field. So we'll start with Cate Owren, Senior Gender Program Manager at the Global Program on Governance and Rights at the International Union for Conservation of Nature, IUCN. The floor is yours, Cate.
Thank you so much, Jessica. That was such a nice introduction. I feel like I don't really have anything to contribute. That was great and so comprehensive. I really want to thank you for the invitation to be here with you. This is an amazing panel of researchers and practitioners. I'm excited to hear all of you. And I really want to just start by thanking you for actually the spirit of this conversation, because as you already started out, you know, I think that we can safely say we are at an existential crisis moment in time, which means we are at an all hands on deck kind of moment in time. And we can't afford, we don't have the time to go it alone. We have to put our information and strategies on the table and see what we can do together. And so I thank you again for this opportunity. And from IUCN side, we very much welcome this conversation. This is really the spirit in which IUCN actually exists and operates. We're working as a convener and a catalyzer as a member union. IUCN is comprised of very diverse government and civil society members, including Indigenous peoples organizations, working together toward a just world that values and conserves nature. And part of that is that we understand that gender equality is part and parcel of that vision. Actually, gender equality is prerequisite to meeting those goals and realizing a safe and sustainable and equitable future. And that, of course, means it requires better understanding and trying to break apart gender-based barriers. In IUCN's gender team, we work across three core interlinked strategies. So first, we're focused on understanding, identifying, and filling critical knowledge gaps at gender environment nexus issues. Secondly, in turn, we use that information and knowledge to try to enhance environmental policy making and programming. Sometimes the reverse too, trying to make the case for a nature positive, environment sustainability focused gender equality or women's empowerment policy framework or intervention. And then third, because we are an implementing organization, really infusing that knowledge and momentum into our technical support, be it at decision-making level, programming, institutional, or hyper-local project activity level. So as a policy guide and an implementer organization, we think that we have this incredible opportunity, but also a responsibility to keep learning, to keep improving our strategies, figuring out what's not working, doing better, communicating our lessons learned, and for sure, joining hands together across sectors, multi-stakeholder processes to try to forge better joint action. So we've worked on gender and climate linkages for a long time, and our work has a really keen focus on a couple of things, on ensuring that climate policymakers and practitioners at all levels have the gender data and information they need to make informed decisions and to act, and that they know where and how to use that data and information if and when it exists. And if it doesn't exist, to try to prioritize attention and investment to gather, understand, and use it. So two of our very recent research efforts, I thought I would mention very quick spotlight here, both of which in several ways really enforce the same findings, the same gap. And that is that many of our countries still don't have the gender data and information that they actually need. And that even when it does exist, it's not yet directly informing more robust, rights-based, gender-responsive climate action at really any scale, which is fundamental to realizing human rights, securing a healthy, safe, and resilient community, global community, and to protect and restore flourishing and nourishing ecosystems. So first, we conducted recently a study examining what we call the triple nexus, which is very much what, Jessica, you've already introduced. We were looking at the relationship between gender inequality, climate vulnerability, and state fragility. And we did this as part of our partnership with USAID, so specifically looking at the 122 countries in which that agency operates to get a sense of what existing research says about the linkages between these issues. Yes, cut to the headline. Yes, they're linked. After a rigorous review of available national data on each of these categories or factors, we developed an indicators framework, which consisted of 27 quantitative national indicators across these three themes, creating literally a frame through which to view this triple nexus of issues and mapping it. And through doing so, looking at these issues through this indicator lens, the linkages between these things got clearer. We could literally start to draw lines. Countries with fewer legal protections against gender-based violence, restricted access to natural and economic resources, restricted inheritance rights, for example, statistically correspond with the countries in similar parts of the world where natural disasters are affecting very high percentages of the population, very high percentages or rates of the population who are agriculture dependent for their livelihoods, as well as state fragility indicators such as high rates of corruption, low levels of political participation, and child marriage. And yes, we do include child marriage in the fragility category. So together, these are creating conditions for the very opposite of resilience and well-being. And it also suggests that we need to consider more integrated approaches really urgently to try to tackle these overlapping and Jessica, as you rightly said, sort of cascading effects on our communities. But a really major finding, yeah? Sorry, Jessica?
Just about 30 seconds.
Okay, perfect. Okay. So a huge finding of this also was just simply the lack of data, that there is such significant, especially on the gender inequality side, significant gaps in coverage of country data and across countries. And then just really quickly, because I know time is short, separately, but very much in coherence, we did another study examining gender-based violence and environment linkages. And here we find very prominently that gender-based violence is regularly used to access and control natural resources, and those dynamics exacerbate an environmental degradation and stressors like climate change. We understand from this work that gender-based violence is varied. It undermines the rights of women and girls and sexual and gender minorities. It threatens peace and security at all levels, and it poses a significant risk to mitigation and adaptation efforts. We found a lot of very specific research gaps across contexts, which we could maybe explore and dive into in the conversation section here, because we find that even though there's a lot of evidence about promising practice, evidence-based strategies to prevent and respond to violence, for example, in disaster settings, we don't necessarily have the tailored context-specific research to be able to immediately apply that to climate mitigation and adaptation decision-making and programming. So I will stop there. I know we're short of time, and I'm looking forward to hearing the other speakers. Thank you, Jessica.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Cate. And thank you for all of the incredible work you're doing. A couple of things that really stood out to me in your remarks was that, not only do we need more data, better data, but we also need to help people understand how to use that data well, which I think is a really key piece of the puzzle. And then I also appreciated that incorporating gender and having gender responsive research and policy and practice isn't only the right thing to do, but as Ambassador Verveer says, it's the smart thing to do too. And so I think that really came through in your remarks too. I'm really looking forward to the next round of our discussion. Thank you so much. So next we will have Janet Edmond, Senior Director of Peace and Development at the Center for Environment and Peace at Conservation International. The floor is yours, Janet.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this great panel. It's nice to follow Cate because CI is a member of IUCN and a very active member at that. So thanks very much. I think most of you probably know Conservation International, but just to let you know that our tagline is "People need nature to thrive." And that really is in line with our mission, which is that biodiversity conservation is really necessary for providing human well-being and sustainable development overall. We've been around since 1987, and we are a rights-based organization, rights-based approach organization. We are the secretariat for what's called the Conservation Initiative on Human Rights. And that is a platform which all conservation organizations agree to respect human rights and improve governance, and gender equality is fundamental to that, as Cate really well laid out. So this is one of our underlying principles. Just to say that we are about 1,000 people working in 35 countries around the world. And our work obviously looks different in the country context in which we work. We work in forests, work in oceans, work with agriculture. So another underpinning strategy is climate change. On all the reasons everyone else has already laid out. Climate change mitigation and adaptation are two of CI's priorities, and the financing that goes along with that, which is critical, and which we're going to hear a lot about, obviously, with the COP coming up. These are all elements in which we're really trying to do a better job of being much more equitable and fair, and that is a whole another discussion. But maybe just to say that CI does have a strong foundation in science, which we combine with partnership and field demonstration. We do have a lot of research on climate change, and then we also have work on conflict sensitivity, and then we have a big program in gender. So we haven't necessarily put it all together right now into the cake, but we're still trying to bake it all together. But just some thoughts on our gender mainstreaming work. We have about 10 years of experience right now. We did a gender assessment, which showed that we really had made significant progress in addressing the gaps in many of our field programs, like in Fiji, in Ecuador, in Peru. Where we really have gotten a better handle on what those gaps are that have been discussed previously, and then building the skills with our staff to be able to better address them with our partners as well. We do have work on conflict sensitivity, which we have been very fortunate to partner with a group called Peace Nexus, which is based out of Geneva, a wonderful foundation there, which has given us very catalytic funding to try to spur deeper look at conflict in all of CI's work. It's very much related to climate change, obviously. And so I think we have a lot more that we could be doing in the triple nexus area. One thing we like to do is give field pilots, like the gender program, give them money, and then they can look at their context and look at what the enabling factors are there that bring these things together. And maybe just to say that Ikal yesterday was on a presentation. She's one of former fellow at CI, and she is a terrific leader in Kenya. And she made a very specific point about research and how it needs to be participatory with the communities. And I think that is something that we need to discuss as we go further, and that it needs to really involve the people who are most affected and impacted. And I think CI does align with that very much. So I think I will leave it there, and maybe I'll get brownie points for being ahead of time. I didn't get a note.
You definitely get brownie points. Thank you so much, Janet, and for everything that you outlined for us and the great work that you are doing. I think the financing piece is a key piece, and I appreciate that you brought that up. And also the participatory types of research being a key consideration that I think more and more organizations are trying to account for, and I'm seeing sort of a normative shift in the field towards more participatory approaches. But I think there's, again, additional capacity needed there to ensure that those aren't also extractive, but are actually able to inform and shape the trajectory of projects and the outcomes in communities. So thank you very much for your comments. Okay, next we have Maisha Alam, Senior Fellow at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research. Maisha, the floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Thank you so much to the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security for organizing this discussion and for inviting me to speak. It's a particular privilege for me, as I formerly served as the Deputy Director of the Institute and led the first report that the Institute did on women and climate change several years ago now. So it's great to be back, and especially exciting to see the work that Jessica and Molly and others have continued to do and really grow in this nexus of climate change and women, peace, and security. So as Jessica mentioned, I'm Dr. Maisha Alam. I'm a senior fellow at the United Nations University Center for Policy Research, which is an independent think tank in the UN system at UN headquarters in New York. And the center has close working relationships with the Executive Office of the Secretary General and a wide range of UN agencies and member states, with staff regularly briefing UN forums, including the Security Council. At UNUCPR, we're fortunate to have several experts who are engaged in climate-related work, including Dr. Adam Daźe, who is our Director of Programs, Dr. Beatrice Mazzello, who's, I believe, on the call here in her UNUCPR and Adelphi capacity, as well as Dr. Adriana Abdennour, who is a Senior Fellow at the Center and the head of a Brazilian NGO, CIPO. And then Crystal Downing, who has had a long career at the UN and formerly with the UK mission to the UN, and is also an expert on gender and conflict and security issues. And each of us has distinct areas of focus and expertise, and together we have been really trying to identify how to move forward in this area of work and bring our various expertise to bear. And so we actually have a forthcoming article that's to be published in the International Peace Institute's Global Observatory journal on how climate considerations can be better integrated into the women, peace, and security agenda at the UN. So for today's discussion, I'll just share a few takeaways from that analysis. I think while understanding of the gender dimensions of climate change is growing, including its differential impacts on men and women, as well as the exclusion of women from decision-making on climate change, major gaps remain, for instance, with respect to security. And namely, there's been minimal overlap to date on the nexus of climate change agenda and the WPS agenda at the UN. And so this is an underdeveloped area of research and policy engagement that's particularly timely and important because the level of armed conflicts globally is at a 30-year high. There are more people displaced across the world than ever before in recorded history. And climate change-related extreme weather events appear to be increasing in frequency, as other speakers have noted. And although there's a growing focus on rapid onset disasters, and for good reason, as all of us can attest, I would for today highlight the need for intersectional research on climate change related risks that are slower moving, yet interact in complex ways with conflict drivers to worsen fragility. So for example, some of our research shows that in the Sahel, climate-driven farmer-herder conflicts have produced a unique set of impacts on women, many of whom are far more vulnerable to shifts in agricultural patterns as smallholder farmers, and who bear the brunt of violence in their communities as climate-related stressors exacerbate within their communities. And the dynamics and impacts of predatory extractivism, both a driver of conflict and a contributor towards climate change, for instance, through greenhouse gas emissions or illegal deforestation, are also deeply gendered and yet understudied and certainly underexplored at the nexus of the WPS and climate change agendas. Women are disproportionately affected by environmental crimes, even as they remain at the forefront of efforts to resist them, and especially Indigenous women's groups. In Yemen, where flash floods have increased in recent years, women have taken leading roles in mediating water disputes and driving forward community adaptation efforts. So these are just a couple of examples, or a few, I should say, examples that I wanted to highlight based on not only our research, but a growing body of evidence. In short, the time is ripe for innovative thinking and pragmatic solutions at the nexus of the international climate change and WPS agendas. So at UNUCPR, we're continuing to work in this space with an eye towards better defining and advancing our research and policy engagement in this space. And so, for example, this forthcoming article that I was just mentioning builds on an October 2020, so exactly a year ago, report that Adam Day led entitled Climate Change and Security Perspectives from the Field, which was a partnership with DPPA, which documented and analyzed the intersection of climate change, conflict, and fragility in Bangladesh, Chad, the Caribbean, Jordan, Guatemala, the Maldives, Nigeria, Tunisia, and with inputs from UN regional offices in Nairobi and Dakar. And we also have a separate policy brief that's forthcoming based on a session that we hosted, and I think, Jessica, you participated in last week as part of the Berlin Climate Security Conference. So it's great to be with all of you, to learn from all of you and share with each other and think about where our respective efforts can hopefully be complementary. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Maisha. I can't wait to read this forthcoming report. I think there are very few that are really looking at how climate and the Women, Peace, and Security agenda in particular, how that perspective is needed within the agenda and what the opportunities are to advance climate response through that agenda. And so we're very much looking forward to your forthcoming research. And I also really appreciate you highlighting this need for an intersectional analysis, that there's multiple factors that we need to be considering as we move forward with the research. And I think that will be really important going forward. So thank you very much. Next, we have Elizabeth Smith. She's a research assistant at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and we're very pleased to have you with us today, Elizabeth. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you very much for convening this discussion. I'm really happy to be here. As Jessica said, I work at the Climate Change and Risk Program at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or CIPRI for short. Broadly speaking, the team in the program explores how, when, and why climate-related security risks occur. And it produces related knowledge on how policy actors can address those risks and how they can strengthen their responses. Gender is a cross-cutting theme that's explored within the program's work. And now I am going to give a brief overview of my past publication on climate change and women, peace, and security national action plans from June 2020. The report examined the consecutive NAPs of 80 states to assess how WPS NAPs understand and respond, and apologies, when I say NAPs, national action plans, how they understand and respond to climate change and security, recognizing the importance of how women and girls' participation in addressing both climate change and conflict The report asked how climate change is framed as an issue, and if and how the plans promote the participation of women and girls in actions addressing climate change. So the report found that NAPs are used by certain countries to explore the nexus of climate, gender, and insecurity. And some also do indeed promote women's participation in addressing climate change. But notably, there was significant room for improvement across the board. And to backtrack just a bit and give some context on the agenda and national action plans in the event that anyone might not be familiar with it, the WPS agenda is a series of UN security resolutions with aims oriented around 4 pillars: the participation of women in peace, security, and governance, prevention of conflict and violence, protection of the rights of women and girls in conflict, and assurance of appropriate relief and recovery for survivors of conflict. The NAPs function as a sort of blueprint for states to improve action and commitment to these aims. What they focus on and how they plan to execute their aims will vary depending on the country, but crucial to their success is how they're constructed and implemented, not just that they've been adopted. So to return to the report, as of 2020, only 17 states had at least one NAP that included but a mention of climate change. And all 17 included references to climate change in the background in the narration sections in varying ways, but significantly fewer included goals and actions directly referring to climate change. The reports focused on Finland, the 3 NAPs of Finland, the 3rd NAP of Ireland, and the 2nd NAP of the United States, as they included comparatively higher numbers of specific goals and activities that uniquely reference climate change. And so to highlight 3 sort of takeaways from this overall analysis is that the NAPs of Finland, Ireland, and the US indeed include actions supporting the participation of women in addressing climate change, which is positive. However, who exactly they are supporting and how is not necessarily clearly defined in the plans, nor is how they may address climate-related risks, human security risks, experienced by women domestically. The plans are oriented outwards. Second, just overall, the plans indicate increased need for understanding climate-related security risks and gender. And third, that actions need to be informed by local knowledge and experiences. So women and girls need to be able to define and address these risks as they experience them. And so I'm going to conclude this overview by noting that the report was done in 2020, and since then, there does seem to be a certain amount of momentum gained within climate change and WPS NAPs. So certain country NAPs have been renewed or published in 2021 that notably feature climate change as an issue, both within narrative sections and actions and objectives. Uganda and Germany are 2 that immediately come to mind, including significant focus on climate change. And within, as the field of gender, climate, and security progresses and policy continues to increase their uptake of this, I would note that women and girls, understandably, are the primary focus, but efforts should be included, encompassing all genders, men, boys, everyone as well, and that seems to be a gap thus far in my observation. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. And thank you for outlining the findings from that report, which is a study that we draw on often at the Institute. It's one of the only ones out there, I think, that is looking specifically at national action plans on WPS and has been really helpful in our own thinking. I think the point you made about who is responsible for implementing recommendations within national action plans and climate aspects of that, and then how that's being done and making sure that's properly resourced and that people have the capacity to do that well is a really key point. And this point that often those plans are oriented outwards, but it will take us working outwards and both within our domestic context in order to meet the challenges ahead. So I really appreciate your contribution. Thank you. Next, we will go to Angie Daźe, the Senior Policy Advisor and Gender Equality Lead for Resilience at the International Institute for Sustainable Development. Angie, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure and a privilege to be part of this very interesting discussion today with such an amazing panel. So for those who aren't familiar with the International Institute for Sustainable Development, or IISD, we are a think tank headquartered in Winnipeg, Canada, and we work on a range of issues related to sustainable development. And this includes resilience to climate and conflict-related risks. And I sit within the resilience team. I lead the work on gender for the resilience team, and what I'll be speaking about today also draws on the work of my colleague, Alec Crawford, who leads our work on conflict and peace building. So within IISD's resilience team, we host the Secretariat of the National Adaptation Plan Global Network. Now, it's going to get very confusing because I'm going to introduce another kind of NAP. National adaptation plans are a key mechanism under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change for planning and implementing adaptation action. And we at the NAP Global Network, we aim to advance these processes around the world. And we work primarily with governments, national governments, on advancing different aspects of NAP processes. So one of the things we're looking at through the NAP Global Network is how countries are integrating both gender and conflict and peace building in their NAP processes. And we're coming at this from two perspectives. So first, that gender inequality and insecurity are underlying causes of vulnerability to climate change, and that they must be addressed if adaptation is going to be effective and sustainable. And then the second is that NAP processes present an opportunity to look at gender, climate, and security issues in an integrated manner. And through the network, a lot of our work is focused on providing technical support to governments and also facilitating peer learning across countries. But there are a few areas that have more of a research focus, so I'll talk about these. So one of the things that we do is to support governments to undertake analysis to inform their adaptation planning processes. So for example, we're currently working with the government of the Central African Republic to do a gender analysis for their NAP process, which will also incorporate a conflict lens. And I think these types of analyses are really important in building the evidence base on the linkages between gender, climate change, and security in particular contexts. And as Cate noted, this is really a gap that we need to fill. We also help countries to develop strategic documents that move their adaptation planning processes forward. So, and what's interesting here is this often helps to frame adaptation issues in a particular country. So for example, Somalia has just completed a NAP framework, and this identifies guiding principles for the NAP process going forward. And these include commitments to ensuring that the NAP is conflict sensitive, that it's gender responsive, and that it's aligned with national peace building efforts. And I think it's going to be important that we learn lessons from countries that are taking this kind of integrated approach if we're going to help inform policy development and implementation going forward. And lastly, we try to synthesize learning from what's happening in NAP processes around the world. So we analyze NAP documents and other sources of information to assess progress and identify trends in integrating issues like gender and conflict. And we're now beginning to look more at where the two issues intersect, though we're a bit early in that process. So one interesting example here is the state of Palestine, where the NAP identifies the impact of Israeli occupation on water resources and highlights how the resulting shortages particularly impact women. So we try to document the trends across different documents in different countries and highlight good examples in knowledge products. And we use the learning to develop guidance to help countries advance their NAP processes. So when it comes to research gaps, I would highlight a few things, and I'm really focusing more, given our role, on the institutional and governance dimensions of adaptation. So the first is more nuanced analysis of the structural barriers to taking these integrated approaches to addressing gender, conflict, and climate change. So looking here at things like institutional issues and siloed and projectized funding and how they impede progress. The second is better evidence on the needs of persons displaced by conflict, particularly women and people who face discrimination. in relation to adaptation to climate change and their inclusion in NAPs and other decision-making processes related to climate change. The third is around process, in terms of what really works to achieve systemic change that addresses these underlying causes of climate vulnerability and how we can enable the relevant actors to invest in these processes. And the last thing I'll mention is it's possibly more of a challenge for researchers than a gap, but I think it's an important issue. And that is, how do we generate evidence that's policy relevant but captures complexity? So, for example, what is needed to inform adaptation planning in fragile contexts is intersectional gender analysis of climate change vulnerability and adaptive capacity with a conflict lens. That's not easy to say, it's even harder to do, and it's even more difficult to communicate in a way that may be compelling to policymakers. So I think that's the challenge that's in front of us as we go forward. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Angie. And I appreciate your identifying this challenge because it definitely is one that we're facing at the Institute as well. I'm sure many people on the panel and also who have joined us in the roundtable session are struggling with this similar challenge. I really appreciate your call for nuanced analysis and all of the work that you've been doing that's developing context-specific information and recommendations. I think that's so important. And this call for an integrated approach is key. And it's very exciting to have both you and Elizabeth on the call talking about different kinds of national action plans. And I'm very interested to see what sort of integrations might be possible between those different areas of work. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the discussion portion. Thank you so much, Angie. Next, we have Hannah Elizabeth Kurnoff, analyst at Adelphi. Hannah, the floor is yours.
Thanks so much. Actually, that was the perfect lead over because I'm trying to address this in what I did research on, how we can actually intertwine those NAPs and how that also serves as an opportunity to go forward. But first, maybe a bit more general. So in our climate diplomacy and security team at Adelphi, we researched the topic together with local researchers and local experts and communicate our findings and try to promote specific recommendations for action so that policymakers and diplomats can act upon our analysis. And with this knowledge then included in their policies and programs and help to build resilience to climate security risks. With our work, we also seek to strengthen and establish a shared understanding of the challenges and opportunities and in addressing climate-related security risks. And as the topic is, everyone already said it, intersectional and connected to so many different aspects, we try to promote a comprehensive and intersectoral and cross-border approach. At Adelphi, we believe that we can't really rely on desk research alone. And that's why I'm stressing it that much, that we really need that local expertise and also the different perspectives from on the ground to achieve a comprehensive analysis. And we therefore also run the Secretariat of the Climate Security Expert Network, which is short called CSEN, and different regional and country-specific CSEN analysis already showed that without including gender lenses into climate security analysis and without climate lenses in gender and conflict analysis, we are not able to see the whole picture and actually to understand the dynamics behind it and achieve sustainable peace. So looking at my piece of the broader Adelphi puzzle, I try to, in my research, but also my daily work, advance the different agendas that exist jointly and look at what we can learn from each other. So during my work and research, it became clear to me that actually that the climate security agenda can and should advance gender equality goals, just like women, peace and security agenda can and should advance climate security lenses. But we shouldn't this only limit it to gender because there are so many different aspects where we could profit from each other, also with regard to youth, climate and security, but it still seems difficult to move this legal framework of the climate security agenda forward on a multilateral level with regard to a topical resolution in the United Nations Security Council. And even though this year, I think Elizabeth already said it represents like a unique momentum, and we already see bits and pieces moving. So I'm still hopeful that we will have a topical resolution someday. But this actually was the initiator for Beatrice Moselle, Jana Greve, and me to look at this topic and actually look at how we can transfer the knowledge we have from implementing the WPS agenda to advance the climate security agenda. And this represents a huge opportunity to strengthen an inclusive climate security agenda and also increase the required international support for a normative UN Security Council framework. National action plans on climate security, just like they exist for women, peace and security, could increase coherence and coordination between government agencies and also advance cross-sectoral approaches to multidimensional problems. The climate security agenda could learn so much from the discussions the WPS agenda already had years ago. And looking at all the expertise and things we know about NAPS, for example, this is like one thing where I really see that we can connect the different dots and really save time to advance faster and more effective. And in contrast to the Women, Peace and Security agenda, bilateral and multilateral diplomacy still drive the climate security agenda from top down, while from the WPS, we know a bottom-up approach, and inclusive national action plan development processes would help to strengthen this bottom-up processes in climate security and engage civil society and locally led organizations, youth, and other often still excluded drivers of change. Interconnecting agenda means advancing agendas jointly and hand in hand, and this helps to mainstream gender lenses in everything related to climate and also vice versa. So climate lenses in everything related to gender, which for me is also the key. Looking now at the things where I see still gaps in the field. So I think many of the gaps already have been identified. And I already said it, and it has been said before by Cate, it's an all hands on deck moment. I think now is really the time where we need to connect the dots and really span the silos we still somehow have and mainstream the perspectives we've heard about today. One gap still seems to me that the things we already know from our research, how do we get them on the ground? How do we get them into the implementation phase and not only on this research level? And also we could learn from the research around the implementation, for example, in UN missions or civil society projects of the WPS agenda to use it for the climate security agenda and how we really start implementing it. Also, of course, our research as well as our work on the ground and the financing mechanisms, also a really important instrument, should be connected and try to span different silos. This is also where I see a lot of improvement. And then we could learn from local and indigenous communities about their challenges and problems and help them to find context-specific answers and then transfer that knowledge into other processes. We could also learn from research on inclusive processes and apply this to adaptation and mitigation. We could expand our research on the different impacts of slow onset and sudden onset events and how they impact societies and especially women in different ways, to use this knowledge to promote structures which help to prevent. We could also look in greater detail at the impacts of changes in ecosystems, such as the Arctic, and what consequences their destruction might trigger around the world, as well as what this would mean for communities and specific community members. And of course, we should use the research out there. And there's plenty, as we've already heard from Elizabeth and Angie, about NAPs and what makes them effective and help countries to really establish inclusive and effective NAP processes and frameworks that should include monitoring. Because we don't need to establish new processes. We could just make it jointly and save time. Yeah, I guess that's it from my side. Thanks.
Hannah, thank you so much. I just really appreciate your call to learn from one another, to try to understand what are the best practices, what are things that are working well in different aspects of this nexus, and how can we apply those. And what really came through was not that these different national action plans are in competition with one another, but there's actually synergies between them that we can use to push forth our collective agendas. And so I really appreciate that. And also the call for bottom-up knowledge, that we can't just rely on desk research alone, but we need to, others have said that as well. And participatory processes are one way to understand local expertise and knowledge and highlight that. So I really appreciate that. And I'm so glad to have you here on the call, and thank you for your interventions. Our last but not least panelist, we have Dr. Marissa Enzer, Chair of the Gender Interest Group at the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. And Marissa, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you, Jessica, for that introduction. I'm thrilled to be in conversation with my fellow panelists and with all of you in the audience on this important topic on the gender climate security nexus. I'm a colleague of Jessica's. I teach at in the Justice and Peace Studies program of Georgetown University. I have a double disciplinary background in environmental anthropology and human rights law. And since Jessica has already discussed the contributions that Georgetown is doing to this field, I thought I would tell you about a different organization with which I am involved. And as she said, I'm referring to the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. As this audience is well aware, there is a well-documented link between environmental stressors, including climate change, and matters of peace and security. Environmental insecurity is known to contribute to political instability and exacerbate gender inequality. Conversely, environmental challenges shared by the former parties to a violent conflict can be turned into opportunities to build cooperation and sustain peace. This is the core premise of environmental peace building, an approach that views conflict over environmental resources as an opportunity for conflicting parties to cooperate with one another and ultimately work towards establishing a lasting and sustainable peace. In this context, gender inequalities and power imbalances can be key factors driving chronic poverty, food insecurity, poor health, violence against women, and violent conflict itself, all factors that are often exacerbated by climate change as a threat multiplier. While peace building can present a springboard for gender equality, the failure to place gender considerations at the heart of environmental peace building disregards women's roles and knowledge of the environment and risks entrenching unequal gender power structures. Consequently, environmental governance in post-conflict settings can have the unintended effect of reinforcing gender inequality rather than being understood as an opportunity to empower women. Some recent exceptions notwithstanding, the environmental peacebuilding literature has not always adequately considered the ways in which environment, climate, gender, peace, and security are inextricably linked, and gender-responsive analyses remain the exception rather than the norm. Dominant perceptions of women as passive victims in conflict settings inhibit their leadership in natural resource management and climate mitigation and adaptation roles. The Women, Peace and Security framework and the literature and practice on environmental peace building must be more efficiently integrated if we are to better address global environmental and climate change, foster gender equality, and build sustainable peace, as Mayesa and Elizabeth and other speakers have already noted. And this is where the Environmental Peacebuilding Association comes in. The association is relatively new. It was established in 2018, and I've been involved with them right from the inception. And nowadays, today, the association is the premier global association dedicated to bringing together researchers, practitioners, and decision makers working on issues of environment, climate, conflict, and peace. And I want to draw your attention to two particular components of the association that should be of particular interest to this discussion. And that one is the Gender Interest Group, of which I'm currently the chair. This Gender Interest Group brings together individuals and institutions committed to ensuring that intersectional gender perspectives are fully integrated into environmental peace building. And several of us are working specifically on on the gender climate security nexus in various contexts and countries across the globe. And hopefully I'll have a chance to discuss more specific details on some of these projects during the second round of discussions, because I realize I'm running out of time and I want to draw your attention to another component related to the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. And I'm referring to the knowledge platform on gender, natural resources, climate, and peace. This platform is the result of a partnership between the UN Environment Programme, UN Women, the UN Development Programme, and the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs. The platform is hosted and co-produced by the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. And there's a monthly newsletter which you can sign up for and receive for free. And you can stay up to date on all the work that is being done in this field. A lot of it is on the gender climate nexus. And hopefully, as I said, I'll have a chance to provide more specific details during the second round. I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much, Marissa. I really appreciate your call, as others have put forth, for an intersectional analysis as part of this work, and how key that will be in order for us to have the type of impact that we're seeking to have. And also your caution, maybe that's not the right word for it, but to be thinking about how the absence of this kind of analysis can end up re-entrenching harms or inequalities that are the direct opposite of what we're trying to do. And so I think that really speaks to the power of an intersectional gender analysis and how important that is to this work. And I just am in awe of all of the speakers that have joined us today, and how willing everyone is to try to share knowledge and cross-pollinate lessons from our various areas of work. And the knowledge platform with the Environmental Peacebuilding Association is another resource for us as a community. And so thank you very much for all of your work there. So now we will go to the question round. We have a few questions for each of the panelists already. And if anyone in the audience has a question, please feel free to put that in the chat, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. But we'll start with a question first for Dr. Alam. Maisha, what institutional frameworks or institutions can we leverage to fill the gaps that have been identified in the research?
Thanks, Jessica, and thanks again to everybody for those really interesting interjections. And I think one of the things that I'm really heartened by is how our various comments have kind of built on each other's and reinforced each other's. So I think, as all of you know, the UN Security Council has recognized that climate change is one of the several factors affecting the stability of countries, and has called for more in-depth analysis, reporting, and risk assessments on the links between environmental shifts and insecurity. And the 2020 to 2022 strategy of the UN Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs, or DPPA, includes climate change as a factor that's driving conflict risks, while UN regional approaches increasingly reflect an understanding that conflict prevention must take environmental changes into account. And so the climate security mechanism, which was established in late 2018 across UNDP, UNEP, and DPPA, and tasked with integrating climate risk considerations across the UN system, I think is one important institution to mention, where there's opportunity for further engagement and cross-pollination. I think the bottom line is that a more holistic approach to addressing gender, climate change, and security is necessary, and based on the recognition of the nexus between these areas of work, as other speakers have already noted. And so this offers an opportunity for synergy between the WPS agenda, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, or CEDAW, and the Climate Change Gender Action Plans, or CCGAPS, that again, our colleagues from IUCN and CPRI have highlighted previously. CEDAW, through its General Recommendation 37 in 2018, became the first UN body to address the links between human rights and gendered impacts of climate change. And I think that's a place where, again, there's real opportunity for further engagement. And as nationally recognized strategies for training and peace building, training and building, the capacity of women and women's organizations on the linkages between gender and climate change, CCGAPS, also bear, I think, an opportunity for bringing these agendas together. But as other speakers have noted, these must be implemented. They have to be operationalized, and for that, gender-sensitive budgeting is required, as is, of course, political leadership to turn those principles and policies into actual results. And, I was going to mention the note about kind of NAPS needing to integrate a focus on climate change, and I think that's already been emphasized. But the bottom line is, much more needs to be done, whether it's by UN agencies, by governments, by civil society, and so on, to move together to kind of integrate these approaches. One last thing I'll note on this that I think is important is I'm really glad that there's so much enthusiasm and optimism and excitement about this agenda, but I think we also have to be really clear about what are the challenges that we're going to be facing in advancing these mutual goals. To give you an example, with the open debate on climate change in the Security Council last month, you can already see resistance from some countries that believe that this is not an issue that deserves space or airtime or focus on the Security Council. And that's certainly something that we've seen with WPS as well. So I think we have to be really clear about the political challenges we're going to face, and also how in the same ways that women, peace, and security has all too often become a battleground for other geopolitical and security confrontations, that climate change has the potential to be the same. And that is going to be, I think, a real kind of impediment going forward, and something we're going to have to be strategic about and work together on. And I think research and evidence has an important role to play in doing that. So let me pause there and hand back to you, Jessica.
Thank you so much, Maisha. One thing that I was thinking of as you were speaking, I was reflecting on also Hannah's remarks, that there are frameworks in place. There are different processes that have already been created. We don't necessarily have to create a whole new wheel, but we have these different entry points and levers that we can pull, and hopefully do so in concert with one another that can really accelerate change. And also that, political buy-in might be a challenge, but also political buy-in as it does grow around climate security in particular is not going to be enough. We also need that operationalization of that buy-in and a greater evidence base to understand how we can do that well, but also to increase those people that may still be skeptical. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. Next, this question is for Elizabeth Smith and Marissa. What do you think is the most critical short-term priority for researchers? Elizabeth, we'll start with you.
Okay, thank you. Yes, so in terms of critical short-term priority, I think something that really sort of is reflected in the conversation that's had today is, and I'm quoting a suggestion from the joint UN report on gender, climate, and security that was published last year, that I would consider the short-term priority, which is furthering a multidisciplinary research network dedicated to empirical research and strengthening knowledge through quantitative and qualitative methods. And it was really great to hear about hear more about the Gender, Natural Resource, and Climate Knowledge Platform, and the other data and experience that the panelists share. And I think bringing people together from all ends of the spectrum who may not necessarily overlap, from security sectors, gender, climate, and as well as people working on the nexus is, and from all over the globe, would be really important.
Thank you. Marissa?
All right, so what is the most critical urgent priority? This is a question that is frequently asked, and I think the answer tends to vary depending on where you're standing, and sometimes quite literally. Much of my current work focuses on climate displacement. I have ongoing projects in the East African community, especially South Sudan and Uganda, and in the Northern Triangle of Central America with a focus on Honduras, where I did field work this summer. Well, research has shown that climate migration is going to become more likely as the planet warms and people seek refuge in places they consider safer or more economically stable. Well, according to a recent UN report, weather disasters linked to climate change have pushed roughly 21.5 million people in countries already struggling with conflict to move each year. On average, since 2010, I'll say it again, 21.5 million people per year since 2010. Well, this is a pattern that is expected to intensify even more as time goes by. And that while this is a recognized trend, we still have a rather limited understanding of the gender impacts of climate migration. The available literature has focused on the ways in which climate-induced displacement puts women and girls at increased risk of sexual assault, poverty, domestic violence, trauma. Women and girls are seen as not only vulnerable to climate displacement, but also vulnerable during displacement. And that without denying this reality, we also need to remember that resilience and vulnerability are not mutually exclusive. I think that we need to gather more data and better data on how women and girls are affected by climate-induced displacement and migration so that we can better understand and try to alleviate their situation. And we also need to support women's efforts to respond to climate threats, including in their own communities, and learn from them and their local capacities and sources of resilience. And this is the part that tends to be overlooked. The focus tends to be almost exclusively on their vulnerability and not on their own and the local capacities and sources of resilience. And well, more funding should be allocated for this and for other efforts to help women adapt to changing conditions on a hotter planet, such as by choosing resilient crops and being able to access microcredit so that fewer will be uprooted from their homes in the first place. I think that research and experience tell us that when women lead in crisis, including climate crisis, entire communities benefit and more effective and sustainable solutions are found. And I think that we need more research that can help us better understand and support this more positive focus. So I'll leave you with that.
Thank you, Marissa and Elizabeth. I really appreciate those reflections and this call for a multi-dimensional approach and a multidisciplinary approach, I think, are important because we're going to need all kinds of data in order to effectively and comprehensively address the challenges that we're facing and that people are facing in their daily lives. And Marissa, I really appreciate your comment that resilience and vulnerability are not mutually exclusive, but often exist alongside one another. And I think this speaks again to the need for holistic understanding and holistic approaches, and to continue to center local knowledge and local forms and resources for resilience in communities. And so thank you very much, both of you, for those thoughtful remarks. Our next question will go to Cate, Angie, and Janet. What evidence and research would be most persuasive or useful for policymakers to act on the climate-gender conflict nexus? Cate, we'll start with you.
Okay, great. Well, I am actually going to change completely what I was about to say because I think so many of you have raised such good points, and I just want to try to echo them. And rather than raise more gaps, hopefully suggest a couple of opportunities. So in our experience working across climate-focused decision-making and programming spheres, we find several things to be important, not an exhaustive list, but among the priorities, we need messages that are grounded in nuanced, context-specific data and evidence, picking up on what Angie said. We need to clearly make the case for gender equality and also environmental resilience at the very same time. We shouldn't have to because many of us are rights-based organizations, but we still need that environment piece, that climate resilience piece to really drive the messaging home and get more stakeholders on board with our collective messages. And we need our messages to be directly relevant to climate adaptation and mitigation spheres, translating evidence across sectors to be applied in others and mindfully without exacerbating risk. Because if we do just translate immediately from one sphere to another, it might not always be the right risk. We see this very much with land rights interventions and gender-based violence. Something that works in one country may not work quite the same way in another place or country. And they have to be actionable. We have to give decision makers and practitioners not only the knowledge, but then the tools, the know-how to be able to act on that knowledge. For sake of time, I wanted to just emphasize or invite everyone's awareness and participation in two efforts that we are trying to take on now. First, for policymakers who need the collected, curated, and communicated data and information, IUCN was so happy to join hands with WeDo, as well as IISD and several other dozen organizations who came together in a commitment to the Generation Equality Forum in June to explore designing and launching together a gender and environment data alliance. This would in part aim to usher and promote your research and help communicate it, package it, translate it to policymakers and practitioners working across these relevant climate-related sectors. So please reach out if you're interested. Second of all, likewise, stemming from this clear need we've identified in our own research addressing gender-based violence across climate-related spheres, we launched with support from USAID the Gender-Based Violence and Environment Linkages Center. And the purpose of this center is to create a go-to space to drive, amplify, and promote learning from emerging promising practice and this nuanced, intersectional, context-specific research that so many of you are already doing, and we hope that we'll all do more of. We need more evidence-based research to be able to then translate the tools so that climate policymakers actually have, again, the tools and the know-how to be able to take on this information and act. So please do be in touch if you're interested. This is the time, again, for collective action and thinking together. So we really invite your ideas and opportunities to work in tandem.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cate. Angie, over to you.
Thanks. So I'm going to try and build on what has already been said, which I completely agree with. And I think, starting with Marissa's point, I completely agree that we need to move on from this sort of women as most vulnerable framing, and that the way to get there is this more nuanced and intersectional analysis of the linkages that we keep talking about. And I think from a policymaker point of view, it's not enough to say that women have these particular vulnerabilities or these particular capacities. It's understanding why. Why is this the case? Because that helps them to see what are the systemic issues that they need to tackle. And then, speaking from the point of view of climate change decision makers, what we have found in the NAP Global Network that's really compelling is evidence of what has worked in other contexts when addressing complex issues in an integrated way, climate change being a complex issue that needs to be addressed in an integrated way. And looking at it from the point of view of gender, climate, and security, I think things like, case studies where integrating gender issues in peace building processes has led to better outcomes with clear descriptions of how this was done, that could inspire climate actors to take similar steps. And I think, often what leads to policy impact is boring things like institutional mechanisms and really effective stakeholder engagement processes. And research often doesn't delve into the details of how these processes unfolded. And that makes it difficult for policymakers to act on the evidence, even if they believe the findings are useful. So I think documenting processes as well as issues and outcomes is important. And lastly, I would just really encourage researchers to talk to policymakers to find out what questions they need answered and how best to communicate the evidence in a way that it's actionable for them.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Angie. Janet, over to you.
Yeah, I think the previous two speakers took everything I was going to say, so that was efficient. And I think I'll just add that, I can't be the only one who has a question mark over my head when resilience and nature-based solutions or those terms are thrown around. So I think connecting what that really means to the people who are most affected, and I appreciate that gender is not just women, right? It's women and men in the roles. So I think we really, really need a lot more intention and thought on that. And for policymakers, the so what, right? We definitely need those messages, the crisp stories that really relate to, their lives as well. Why is this important to them? I will just say I'm the the co-chair of CI's research ethics policy, which looks to make sure that we protect human subjects research. So when we talk about research, I kind of get like, do we have all the protections in place? Are we really being careful about this? And the over-researching thing, right? Even though I called for participatory research, it concerns me. I think there's a lot more that can be done in that space, right? To make sure that we are protecting the people that we're talking about. So, and I think if you guys watched the Equator Prize thing yesterday, there's like so many great success stories in this space. I think figuring out what those enabling conditions are that made those 10 winners really successful in the climate change, many of them have a gender aspect to it, and the conflict, it would be really important to understand those more. So.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Janet. Thank you to everyone that answered that question. And again, calling for this nuanced and intersectional analysis that's context specific, and figuring out really how, what are the questions that policymakers and practitioners have. How can that inform the types of projects we're undertaking? And then what is going to be the most effective way to communicate that evidence to policymakers in a way that they can act upon it? And while keeping in mind our own ethics of research, our principles to do no harm. And so really trying to figure out how I think the research community can be a link between local knowledge, local forms of resilience, local knowledge around the capacity that they need in their communities, but also the solutions they've come up with, and then how to bring that to people in a way that they understand, what is the problem, why is it a problem, and then so what does this mean for the outcomes of all of the areas of work that we're engaged in. So thank you all for that. So we have another question for Hannah. So Hannah, one of our goals today is to build bridges between researchers working at various intersections of the gender climate security nexus. I would love to hear your thoughts about how a community of practice might be helpful, what form or mission it should take, and how do we scope a feasible and meaningful community. I know there's a lot of, we've all talked about being part of this community. There are various different efforts happening in different sort of corners of this work, but we would love to know a little bit more from your perspective about what might be most helpful.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I think there already was a question from Molly in the chat regarding this as a specific entry point to bring all the dots together. And in my opinion, a community of practice around gender and climate security would really help to bring the expertise and knowledge we have together and push the climate security and also women, peace and security agenda forward. As has been said, this gap really needs to be filled, which is still existing also between the different areas of work and expertise, and also a community of practice really seems to me as the easiest way to bring it all around one table. We could also include this community as sort of a feedback or sounding board or mechanism for different topics, and therefore enabling a more inclusive expertise and to have a knowledge spillover also to other areas. And actually helping to establish a community of practice is also what this conference is all about. So Adelphi is hosting BCSC to really bring the different parts of this climate security agenda together. And for me personally, it has been really enriching to create this space for all the different partners to share what they do and to get them all together and to get them in touch. And also this webinar for me kind of shows how important it is to really exchange on the different things we do, because even though I'm really interested in doing research in it, I don't know all about it. So for people not in touch with the subject, it must be even more enriching to hear about all the things that are going on and to really connect those different dots a bit better. And yeah, using those synergies we can create to actually span across the different sectors and create save time and energy and to advance quicker and be more effective together on the ground. I think that's it from my side.
Thank you, Hannah. At the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security, we're also very interested in how we keep these kinds of conversations going how we make sure that they're not just one-off events, but, you know, part of a longer arc of a conversation and collaborative work among each of us. And so we look forward to continuing to figure out together what's going to be most helpful with regard to that, and who else needs to be part of this conversation, because we have a powerhouse panel today. But I think this is just the tip of the spear in terms of people that are engaged in various aspects of work around the nexus, and also how we bring local communities and the local stakeholders into these conversations to also inform our community of practice. So thank you very much. We have amazingly a few minutes left for audience Q&A. Well done to everybody who stayed kind of within the time constraints, which we never have enough time for these conversations. But as I said, hopefully this is just the first of many. One question I wanted to pose to the group is around field work. And so a lot of us have emphasized the need for additional evidence from the field, for understanding what is working for people on the front lines of addressing climate conflict impacts. We're really interested in at the Institute and how those things that are working might be scaled. But in terms of field research, it's, as we all know, it's been very difficult right now, especially during the pandemic, to do field research. But what, you know, are there any recommendations that anyone has about how to create opportunities for more field research within our organizations? As we know, this is not always as fast and certainly not as cost effective as a desk research project is. But how do we support this shift towards more buy-in in our organizations and our work for funding for field research and the time that requires? And then are there any best practices in terms of doing field research in a way that's participatory, that doesn't cause harm? Would love to know from the panelists about that. Marissa, I know you've recently been in doing some field research. Do you want to take a first go at that question? Sorry, I muted. Yeah, there you go.
Am I on?
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So yeah, I recently returned from Honduras, where I was doing research on the gender, environmental change, displacement nexus. Honduras is a country where I've been working on and off for almost 20 years now. In fact, I did my dissertation research on disaster-induced displacement in the aftermath of Hurricane Mitch. And I think that familiarity with the context facilitates the possibility of doing research under the current circumstances, because the kind of research that I do, at least, as I said, I'm trained as an applied field anthropologist, environmental anthropology, requires close interaction with my research participants. And so that's something that requires more time. And in some of the countries where I'm doing research, I'm not actually going there because it wouldn't be possible for me to spend as much time as I would need to be able to develop those relationships. So in the case of Honduras, I was able to travel without any problem, and I pretty much did what I would have done under non-pandemic circumstances. In some of the other countries where I'm working, one of them being South Sudan, again, another country where I've done field work for, on and off for the last 15 years. I'm not actually going there this year. Last time I was there was in the summer, fall of before the pandemic. And I have teams on the ground. And this presents some ethical considerations. I'm glad that Janet mentioned this, because it was something that I was thinking about myself, which is the issue of outsourcing risk. Okay, a strategy that is frequently employed during non-pandemic times as well, when we are working in conflict-affected countries, for instance, which is another focus of my research. One of the ways in which some of us in the global north tend to approach doing research in problematic countries, fragile countries, is by hiring local consultants. But this is something that needs to be approached with great care. I wouldn't do that in a country that I hadn't actually visited myself personally without good knowledge of what the conditions on the ground are. Because first of all, I wouldn't have sufficient basis on which to assess how rigorously the research has been carried out. And I would be concerned about the fact that the risk is still there. And the fact that local consultants are doing it, do we really have any grounds on which to assume that they are not putting themselves at risk? Sometimes the fact that they are local people, especially perhaps more in a conflict situation than in an environmental crisis kind of situation, perhaps this puts them at an increased risk. And so this is something that needs to be, I'm not saying that is not possible. I'm not saying that good data is not retrieval under these conditions, but I think that it requires far more consideration of the rigor with which the research is being carried out, as well as the ethical implications. And I'm not sure this is always happening. What I can tell you is that research continues. I'm involved in a number of projects and in a number of consultancies, which include research in other countries. So the pandemic has made things more difficult, not impossible, but it has created different challenges that perhaps we are not accustomed to considering. And I think that's important. And I would highlight those, how rigorous the research can be, and what are the ethical considerations that need to be paid attention to.
Thank you very much. Janet, do you want to add on to that?
Just quickly to say that one way that CI has addressed this is to have fellowships where we support Indigenous people, women, different groups, and that research may not be, rigorous in terms of protocols, but it is local research, and that's one way I think that we have seen that is possible somewhat in the pandemic. And so just to say that is, another source of very important information. So,
thank you. Yes, thank you both. And I think that both you highlighted that this is not always so straightforward, and there's tensions between our various commitments. We don't want to outsource risk, but we also want to support local researchers and local actors. How do we do that in a thoughtful way? And I think these kinds of conversations are really productive in thinking through how to do that well. We are at time. I am sorry for anyone who posed a question that it did not get answered. I know there are hopefully there will be many more conversations to come. We will plan to send out a slide deck that has information for each of the panelists, both what their organization is engaged on, what their current research is, and contact information for them. So we'll be sure to share that with everyone who's attended. And I think there's also links embedded in there to some of the research that has been mentioned today, and we can follow up with additional links for everyone that has attended. So I would just like to close with a warm thanks to all of our panelists who joined us in this conversation, everyone who joined in the roundtable discussion. I am excited about the synergies that we've seen today. Of course, there are many challenges ahead. There are gaps that need to be addressed, but I feel heartened and encouraged by this community of researchers and scholars and practitioners who are so committed to addressing these issues in thoughtful and relevant and actionable ways. And so just want to thank again Adelphi and Hannah for helping to coordinate this wonderful research roundtable and inviting the Institute to participate. And a warm thanks to my colleague Jennifer Grossman Fernandez, who has been just instrumental behind the scenes in helping to make sure that this was a successful and productive conversation. So thank you, everyone.
Jessica, can I just make one small request on behalf of others? In addition to, I know you said you would share a summary or some kind of document, but I think a lot of people have put in some interesting points and links in the chat. Would you mind circulating those as well? I think
Absolutely.
That would be helpful for everybody.
Yes.
Thanks so much,
Thank you
everybody.
for reminding me. I would have closed out without copying.
I always hate it when I leave a Zoom call and then the chat history is gone and I've missed out all that great information and resources on all of that. So it would be really helpful.
We will be sure to capture that. Thank you.